The scene opens with the energetic, ambitious young journalist at the national news desk editor's cubicle, and without even waiting to be recognized, blurts out her news. "Chief, I've come across the story of a lifetime."
Sure.
It turns out there is this guy in Michigan, who does what might be called forensic legal research, historical background, fine print parsing, untangling legalese, that sort of thing.
I've heard similar stories before.
Well, in 2001 or 2002, the guy decided to focus on the income tax. He ended up uncovering mind-boggling stuff, Chief.
Sounds like just another tax protester story.
Ever since the guy published his findings in 2003, tens of thousands of people have been routinely paying zero in federal and state income tax, Social Security tax, and Medicare tax, every year. Zero.
Sounds too good to be true.
Instead, these people get complete refunds of everything they had paid in, or had withheld from them.
That's a big claim. Need real proof to back it up.
This isn't some kind of tax protester nonsense. These people have recovered billions, Chief. That's billions of dollars, with a B. And not just from the feds, but from all the state governments too. And they've been doing it for almost 15 years. Even when the IRS tries to argue with them, these people end up keeping all their money. Chief, this is the story of the century.
Listen, Jess, I can see you think you've really found something. And I'm delighted to see that you can get so excited at what seems like a big scoop. I remember when I had that kind of enthusiasm. But young lady, think about it. What you think you've found can't possibly be true. Simple logic says so, because as you yourself just said, if it were true, it'd be the story of the century, and believe me, I'd have heard about it.
Chief, of course that's just what you'd think. It's what anyone would think. And that's part of the story, Chief. That's exactly what everyone has thought. And that's why no one has ever checked this out before. No one has ever reported it. You think it can't be true because no one's ever reported it, when the only reason no one's ever reported it is because everyone assumes someone else would have covered it by now.
Maybe yes, maybe so.
There is another reason too, Chief, and you're going to love it. Remember, what this guy has exposed amounts to the biggest government scam in American history. Think about it. Millions of people paying as much as 40% of everything they earn in taxes they don't owe. For decades and decades.
Another government scam.
So, the feds have been trying to suppress this guy's work for the whole 15 years they've been making all those refunds. It's a massive cover-up of a massive scandal. I've looked at some of the stuff that's been done. I've never even heard of anything like it. This is corruption that'll make your hair stand up.
IRS, DOJ, FBI, they just keep coming.
The biggest thing has been rigged against him. Via judicial proceedings, faked up attacks on the researcher, meant to make it look like the court system disagrees with what he says about the tax. But when you examine the details, it turns out that the attacks actually confirm what the guy says.
No way. Not in America.
For instance, the first 4 attacks on the researcher, efforts to accuse him of promoting an abusive tax shelter and using that as a pretext to enjoin publication of his first book, failed, one after another. The DOJ itself was forced to move various courts to dismiss its suits.
What about the First Amendment, prohibiting the free exercise thereof? Or abridging the freedom of speech?
Next up was a phony or erroneous refund lawsuit, alleging that refunds made to the researcher and his wife were mistakes by an IRS which simply wasn't paying attention. The government lied its ass off about anything being a mistake. In fact, during that period, this researcher was the subject of what might be the most intense attention by the IRS given to anybody in history. At the end of this extra special attention, the IRS had to issue the refunds.
Interesting. If it can be proven.
That phony lawsuit ended with a summary judgment making phony assertions, as so-called found facts, about the content of the researcher's first book by a judge, who later was forced to admit she had never read it, and who also had never seen or heard from a single witness. The researcher was later attacked with phony charges of not believing the outcome of his own work, and thus filing false returns. Among much else, His jury was given as evidence the phony found facts from the phony lawsuit ruling, without the appearance of any witness who could reveal the true character of that lawsuit. The man's jury was also prevented from seeing actual statutory text central to the charge, and ordered to deliberate using prosecution written substitutes for these statutes.
Unreal for any U.S. court of law.
But Chief, as bad as all of this is, it gets worse. When this civil assault and even the criminal assault didn't stop the researcher or his readers, or the tax agencies, who chunked out tens of thousands of complete refunds while the guy sat in prison for 2 years, the corrupt officials behind the bogus tax scheme he had exposed began beating up on his wife. This is real mafia great stuff, and you've got to see it to believe it.
I need a stiff drink.
Like I was saying, the exposed tax schemers hadn't been able to shut the researcher up by attacking him directly, and the bogus legal attacks had done more harm than good, with the truth glaringly clear to anybody reading between the lines.
Attacking his family?
So the schemers started on the guy's wife in 2013. She was then 58, a housewife with a minor child and no legal knowledge at all. Plainly this mob, the best word for them, I think, figured to get at the researcher through his family, and maybe to start scaring his readers by a display of lawlessness and brutality at the same time.
Equal justice, for some.
The assault on the wife reached back for its pretext to the phony civil lawsuit in 2006. As I told you earlier, the government had no grounds for saying that the couple owed it any money and weren't entitled to the refunds they had claimed. That's why the schemers had to resort to the fake examination report. Well, at the same time, they tried to work around that problem by including in their summary judgment orders, commanding the couple to replace their filed tax returns with new ones, returns dictated by the government. These folks were ordered to say they believe their earnings qualify for the tax, something no one from the government would ever do. Remember though, the government knew perfectly well that this was not true. The couple were even told they had to conceal the fact that what they said was by government command.
The old government gag order routine.
Of course the orders were never obeyed. What American would do such a thing? Well, this gave the schemers the pretext they needed, as long as they were willing to get really corrupt. And they were. These IRS thugs engineered or at least produced an indictment of the wife for criminal contempt of court. The judge who got her case was a colleague of the judge who had presided over the civil suit and had also been the judge in one of the early failed attacks on the researcher himself. She brushed aside all motions to dismiss, even despite the obvious First Amendment problems, with orders dictating the content of sworn statements.
Corruption multiplied.
The case first went to trial in October of 2013 with the wife speaking for herself. And listen to this, Chief. Because of the obvious illegality of the orders involved in the charge, the judge instructed the jury, at the government's request, that the unconstitutionality or unlawfulness of the orders is not a defense to the charge. Can you believe the brazenness of this corruption? But glory be, this housewife, up against a team of specialist shark prosecutors flown in from Washington and a co-opted judge, ended the first trial with a hung jury. Still, they came back at her again, because defending their bogus tax scheme is that important to these corrupt officials.
A second time.
In her second trial, in July of 2014, the wife wasn't even allowed to complete her opening statement. She was interrupted constantly throughout her examination of witnesses by judge and prosecutors. She was kept from reading Supreme Court rulings on speech rights to the jury, had the jury's view of her tainted by lies from both the prosecutor and the judge about the government's obligation to produce competing returns I mentioned earlier, and had an outright evidence fraud perpetrated against her just before closing arguments, during which she was again interrupted constantly.
I can see where this is going.
After the jury was sequestered for deliberations, the judge went into the jury room by herself. No one knows what got said, but after all that, and with the unconstitutionality or unlawfulness of the order not a defense instruction, the jury came back with a guilty verdict this time. So, the judge denies all post-trial relief out of hand, and sentences the wife to a remarkably harsh 18 months on this contempt charge. thrown into the sentences in order that when she gets out of prison, she must make the false statements ordered in the civil lawsuit within 60 days or face more time. The Sixth Circuit hears the wife's appeal, but, wait for it. It rules that it doesn't have to make a decision on the constitutional problems with the orders over which she was convicted, and refuses to do so. It even argues in its ruling that lawful is not an element of a criminal contempt charge, despite the language of the statute, which only criminalizes disobedience or resistance to a court's lawful writ, process, order, rule, decree, or command.
Even the appeal totally failed.
A year after she gets out, the Washington Shark, who was the lead prosecutor in her trials, that's the one who did the lying about the competing government return mandate and also the evidence fraud, moves the court to have the wife re-imprisoned. The pretext is her continued refusal to make the false returns. The government wanted those false returns really badly. Without them, the civil trial thing from way back in 2006, based solely on that fake examination report I told you about earlier, remains without even the appearance of a leg to stand on. And it's the phony summary judgment in that case that forms the basis for every attack on both the researcher and his wife since then. What a tangled, ugly web, eh, Chief?
And then some.
Here's the real kicker, Chief. All the while that all of this has been going on, it's obvious that every bit of it is fraudulent even without looking at the legal details. Because since 2003 those refunds have kept going out, week after week, month after month, year after year.
Proof?
Sure do. I have examples for you to look at, Chief. I have one that shows more than $66,000 back from the feds, with $11,000 just in interest. And the date the check was cut, August of 2010, just after the researcher went to prison that June for letting the cat out of the bag. In fact, look at the same guy's Arizona refund for the same year right below. Actually issued in June. Documents showing a 7-year struggle by the IRS to browbeat one of the guy's readers into caving on what they propose to be a $147,000 tax liability for 2008, before finally just fading away last year. All while the researcher was imprisoned for telling this guy what is obviously the truth, and all through the beating up on the researcher's wife. Another? Look at this year-and-a-half plus effort to do the same to a doctor during a chunk of that same period, claiming he owed more than $120,000, before finally admitting the truth and issuing an amount due notice of $0, nothing, nada, zilch.
Even more proof?
Here's one from July of 2018, Chief. A nice, fat check for more than $97,000, with $980 in interest from the delay, while the IRS challenged the claim. Hundreds of thousands of checks and notices, totaling billions of dollars, Chief. And all before, during and after every one of these fake legal actions against the guy who spilled the beans and then the beating up on his wife. In fact, the guy's got a funny little image on his website, illustrating the absurdity of what the folks doing the cover-up hoping we'll all believe about all this, in spite of the obvious truth. Take a look at losthorizons.com/newsletter/ACK!15.jpg.
You bet I will.
Perfect, right? We're supposed to think all these refunds, year after year, are just the biggest, most sustained bureaucratic screw-up in world history, and to do so, we're supposed to overlook those focused efforts to keep the scam alive that we just uncovered, which plainly are no accidents. The IRS even maintains troll sites on the internet to spread bogus tales of people getting penalized for making these filings, and fake pages on its own site, in order to prop up the ridiculous idea that these refunds are just hundreds of thousands of constant, identical mistakes, by different IRS offices and state tax agencies around the country. Let's face it. This story has biggest in history written all over it. We've got to get this story out there, Chief. Jessica is so right. We all must pray that this story gets out there, at long last. We must pray that some journalist with a big voice sees this story. We must pray that this big-voiced journalist then reaches deep inside and finds a big pair
We must pray that this pair is big enough to juice him or her into putting the public interest in front of their fear of retribution for showing the American people that officials lie like cheap rugs when it suits them. They must help the American people learn how to defund the out-of-control state that's been doing all that lying.
Pray hard for these good things, but more, work hard for them. As one good man who knew how to get a lot done once said, with tongue firmly in cheek,
I am a great believer in luck, and I find the harder I work, the more I have of it. Thomas Jefferson.
The freestanding post of The Conversation, in which will be found links to the evidence of everything described in the preceding story, can be found at www.losthorizons.com/a/theconversation.htm.